We're going to talk about routing and how routing works with your ASP.NET applications. But I always think it's helpful before we talk about the specifics to kind of just look at how routing works in general on the internet. So I drew this little diagram. Over here we have a browser, and then we have a server and a database. When you navigate the web, your browser is making requests to servers, and so every time you go to a web page, it's going to ship off a bunch of information like the URL and a couple of other things to whatever server you're corresponding with. So when you go to Facebook, you send a URL to Facebook's server, and then it gives you a document back eventually. So when you're developing, you're going to be making requests to a server that's running your ASP.NET application. Now, ASP.NET is just a special program that is running and always listening for requests to come from the browser. And when it gets a request, it's going to do a lot of things to determine what kind of document it should return so that your users get what they're looking for. One of the first things it does is it looks at this URL string and it tries to determine which portion of your application it should run. So which controller it should find, which action it should run, which view it should render, and that is the responsibility of the route config. So ASP.NET receives this, and in your route config, you're going to write some patterns that tell it, when you recognize something that looks like this, I want you to run this specific piece of code. And we'll look at some examples of that exactly. And as it's running that code, ASP.NET is capable of reaching out to your database to grab information about a user or an instrument or whatever is stored in your database. It can build a template, and then it can send it back. Something I always think is helpful to remember is that the documents that it sends back, they're really just text. It's some HTML that's just a special kind of text, and it has some links to some CSS and JavaScript. But at the end of the day, you're getting a string in from the request, that's the URL, and you're giving a string back that is just a document or a view or some HTML that you want to return to the user. So now that we talked about routing in general, let's talk about how routing works specifically for ASP.NET. You'll see I have a route config file open right now. Mine might look a little bit different than yours looks, but they're all basically the same. I have this route here. Yours might look like that. It might look a little more like this one I've commented out underneath. You might have some different using statements at the top, but this is going to be the basic ideas of how routing works in .NET. So you'll see by default, we get a route that is pointing to the home controller and has the index action, and it's asking for an ID. If we look down here, we'll see that this pattern is really saying we get a controller, we get an action, and we get an ID, and the ID is optional. So what does that mean? If I come to this URL, what happens is my browser is going to send a request, and it's going to send this URL string that is /home/contact. Let's look back at that template. So it goes to /home/contact. It's going to go find the home controller and the contact action. And let's go see what that looks like. So if I open my home controller and I find the contact action, this is the code that is going to run when I receive a request at that URL. And it's going to render a view and do some other things. But the most important thing is to remember is you get a string in and it matches that template, and then you get a string back out, which is the view in this case. So let's try writing a route together. So we're going to try to write a specific kind of route. We're going to use the one from the example earlier. So we're going to go to the instrument controller, the show action, and we're going to give it an instrument as well. So let's type routes.map route. And I'm just going to kind of copy what I have here below for now. We're going to see how that does. So let's call this instruments. And you can call this name anything you want. This is just to help you remember what each of your routes is doing. And in my template, I'm going to say it has to start with instruments. And then I'm going to have an action. And then I'm going to have an instrument. All right, and let's make sure I got that right. So we have our action, or our controller, instrument, and then our action, show, and then our actual instrument, which in this case is flute. So instrument, action, instrument. Okay, That might seem a little confusing, but hopefully it'll make sense by the time we finish this. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'm going to make a new controller that matches my route. Alright, so I went ahead and I created an instrument controller, and you'll see I've made two actions within here. I've made the index action, and I've made the show action. So let's look at this index action first. I'm just doing this to demonstrate the point once again that all we're doing is we're sending strings back and forth. So this is explicitly going to return a string, and I just returned this little phrase, welcome to the instrument controller, and let's try going that. So if we look at our routes over here, we have our template and we know we need to go to instrument and then the name of the action. So in this case, it's going to be index. And we need to make sure that this is optional. All right. So if I go to /instrument/index, there you go. We get the string that we returned in our controller, and it shows up. It doesn't look very pretty, but it's the string that we decided to send over. So let's take a look at something that's a little more practical. So using the same pattern, we're going to do the example from before, and I made this show action. And the show action is doing a couple things. The first thing it's doing is it's receiving a parameter from the URL. You'll notice that over here we have this named parameter, instrument, the same way we have one down here called ID, and we receive that as a parameter to our action. And it's just a string, and it's whatever comes after that final slash. We're going to put it into our view bag so that we can access it in the view, and then we're going to return a view. So I need to create one. I'm going to make a new folder called instrument, and a file in there called show.cshtml. And let's just do something simple. All right, looks like a great start to a show page. So if I come back here and I do show flute like we had in the example, all right, so you'll see we load this up and we get this page that has our instrument name in it. It says congratulations, so this is just the template that we made. And you'll see if we change this to trumpet, we get a listing for trumpet or tuba, and it'll give me tuba. So that's one way that you can dynamically put some information. My database isn't set up for this, but just to show you something else that you might be able to do, when you get that instrument name, instrument dot where instrument name equals instrument. So this would find me all of the instruments that are named tuba or flute or whatever is on the URL. And that would give you an opportunity to make these dynamic views that are pulling things out of your database. So just to review, this is all that's happening the whole time. You're getting a string that's a request. You have a URL. ASP.NET is going to do a lot of work on that URL to determine where it should go. And it's going to create a string of HTML, and it's going to send it back to the browser. What that looks like in practice is we have our route config file, where we define some routes, and we give it some rules so that it knows how to match our controllers and everything together. And then when we put it in practice, we get an actual working website that serves up the data that we want.